We're honored to have Dr. Tate with us for a portion of our meeting today. As many of you know, he's currently Provost and Executive Vice President of Academic Affairs at the University of South Carolina. He was also a member of this department from 1992 to 2002. We're also joined today by Dr. Walter Stern from Educational Policy Studies, Dr. Erika Bullock, and Dr. Carl Grant.
Good morning. Dr. Tate says that segregation requires both a combination of psychological and physical treatment. And he connects that idea of psychological treatment to hope as placebo. But Dr. Tate, you bring up this idea of what we need to think about before using this treatment. And you talk about two, what I call issues of research. One of them being studies focused on measuring, and I might add describing or explaining racial gaps. And the other is this danger that studies can cause people to see proximity to Black students as an inherent source of underperformance. And I think those are two dangers. I think they jumped out at me because of the work that I have been doing, which is asking this question about what is the set of axioms about Black children or Black people that undergird most equity-oriented research and practice efforts, both historically and contemporarily. So I wanted to bring this forward as a prevailing logic related to the fact that there is a belief that proximity to whiteness, in this case, direct control by whiteness, is actually something that creates and promotes health within Black people who are inherently prone to ignorance or barbarism. There remains this prevailing belief that proximity to whiteness is going to create the health, the vitality, and the success for Black children or Black people in all areas, which includes education. But we have many models that show otherwise. To quote Dr. Tate, Black excellence did not require integration. And he relies on the work of Vanessa Siddle-Walker, of Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, who's with us today, Dr. James Anderson, as examples of work highlighting that fact. And if we look at Dr. Carl Grant, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, Dr. Tate as examples over time of people who were educated in spaces that were more and less integrated across that time span, we see these examples of excellence. This brings up this idea that you close with, Dr. Tate, thank God that we can change. As I was thinking about what that change needs to be, I thought about the idea that we've never actually had a conversation in this country about integration. Brown decision was not a conversation about integration itself. So if we are actually seeing value in integration, then we actually have to bring that to the table in a larger scale policy discussion. I look at this focus on integration as the change that I see as necessary. So this idea that we actually bring multiple strands together rather than trying to pull everyone into one lane, which I would argue would be a lane that is connected to whiteness and or white supremacy. If we're actually going to bring people together, then it's bringing people together on equal footing rather than a reliance on these racial hierarchies.
One thing I was wanting to engage in discussion around is how we are defining the disease of racism. What is the root cause and what is it that Brown was merely treating? Especially during the pre-Brown suppression era, they emphasized the ideology of racism manifested in terms of racialized disparities in access to resources as well as opportunity. And Dr. Tate also stressed segregation as a tool to maintain order. And I really appreciate the concluding message that Dr. Tate gave us about hope and reminding us that hope protects, that protection promotes healing, and that healing provides the opportunity for growth and change. And that while placebos are not an actual cure, placebos can actually trigger our systems into doing things that are good for us and that lead towards healing. And so this message of hope certainly resonates with me. Emphasis on the capacity of individuals to change, I feel, is essential. But more and more over the last number of months, thinking of our current political climate, raises the question of how do we strike a balance between maintaining hope that change is possible and the recognition of all the work that is needed to actualize the change.
Much like Walter, I come away with questions. What was going on around and during that time? Because it is hard to consider Brown out of the context of what were people failing. Because during that time, what you had were Black people scratching for power. The desegregation of school was a way to deliver a sort of power to the African American community.
Thank you for the comments, Walter, Carl, Erika. Let me start with this issue of power. If we look at the NAACP, you would look at them as a fair broker in all of the activities, and they clearly were sacrificial. They were going in the Deep South, attempting to integrate the schools. They were working diligently. They worked in the community context. But if you look at Derek Bell's 1976 article in the Yale Law Review, where he describes NAACP's decision-making strategy, there's where you see power. They made a decision that integration was important. Most of the clients simply wanted a high quality education. They were not necessarily interested in integrating with white people. They simply wanted good schools. And the NAACP made a decision, a power-based decision, that an integrated society was the kind of society that we needed. I also want to back up a second and just give you all a little bit of thinking about the coronavirus pandemic. If you think about how it was framed by our administration, it was raced. The pandemic was called the China virus for a reason. And that's what led me to using pandemic as a metaphor. We should think about pandemics of racism as an ecological disruption, which segregation, housing discrimination, food deserts, etc., are merely symptoms also having their own ecological effects. If we begin to think about it as an ecology, it all begins to make sense in that segregation in and of itself is not bad, but it does have effects.
What do you believe is most important for anyone addressing race, racism, and racialization in the U.S. to understand about the Black freedom struggle?
Well, as we are searching within our department about what do we do and how do we do it, I kind of hold up the mirror. What he said about historically Black colleges is so true. So how do we as a department compete with that? So when students come here, they are allowed to pursue their dreams.
One of the things that I think is relevant for Brown is the way in which we diagnose the disease of racism. Often it's constructed as a psychological problem with the sort of pathologizing of Black children, Black families, and Black communities. And I wonder, relative to our own department, if we begin to move away from that framing and instead thinking about racism as a structural problem, as something that has been created through a series of events, individuals, and actions, how that reshapes then what we think. Because the problem isn't that we bring in Black students or students from minoritized communities. The problem isn't them. The problem is essentially us and what we've created. And so how do we think about the problem in that way?
You know, let's just talk about that for just a second. In my opinion, to provide small, carefully done analytical work in pursuit of what might only be very small incremental change. And that hope that I conduct research so that if people learn, we hope that it humanizes them. That is all we have. There is nothing else. You know, Fritz Hollins, I don't know if the man was a racist at the end of his life. I do know that he started with one position related to segregation and appeared to pivot where he advocated for some things that at bare minimum seemed to, in incremental fashion, change the lives of others. And that's all I could ask from each individual.